Hello, my name is Chandler and thank you for tuning in. So today, some of you may have known that we're building a rocket. Now the rocket obviously is going to need a carbon source. So why is carbon so important? Carbon is useful because without carbon we won't have complete combustion, and then we'll end up with a significant amount of residue left over. But if we had carbon, a lot of what's released is turned into, instead of just a carbon compound like when you burn sugar, it's turned into carbon dioxide gas. So what we're going to do today is we're going to make our own charcoal. So to get started, we're going to have to gather, of course, some organics. And here, if you look just behind me, you can see some of the stuff I've gathered. So the first thing I want to say is that everything I've gathered has been from something that's already been dead, and leaves and branches that I found on the road. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I have here. So we've got some of our lighter material, like our hays and our grasses, and then got some heavier branches, and then over here we've got very spindly, very thin branches. So I'm going to pause the video here and I'm going to go ahead and begin construction of our little pit, and I'll show you what we're going to do with all this. So to begin building your charcoal pit, you're going to want to start with very thick, sturdy branches at the base. Now as you can see, I've gathered some branches with little V-shapes in them, so that way they can be more sturdy. And this is going to be where the majority of our charcoal comes from. The next step is to add the thinner branches around here, on the outside. Very similar to building a campfire. And finally, you're going to want to add these little very thin grass-like branches. Now I'm going to show you how to put these on, because it can be a little difficult and it's important that you get that right. So you take a small amount of your thin grassy branches, and you want to layer them starting from the bottom as like a miniature foundation, and you kind of want to pack it in very lightly. And you continue this all the way around the base. Now once you've got completely around, you can start packing on top, sort of like this. So you take some more branches and you place it over the other ones. Just continue doing that until you've got like a solid little nest of some sort. Now living in the desert, there's this type of grass or some sort of plant that's very common out here. Now I'm not sure what it is, but this is excellent for making that little nest around the outside, since it can just sort of fan out along the outsides of your core. And of course, you've got bigger branches sort of like this that are kind of thicker at the bottom but very light at the top. You can just break off the top branches. Once you break off all those branches, you'll end up with this sort of mess of very thin branches. Now you can't really layer it on like the other branches since they're so spaced out. But if you pack it in a little bit, you can sort of get that same nest feeling. And that's a good foundation for other lighter materials. For example, this is an old tomato plant that didn't make it really. It's been there for a very long time. And you can layer those leaves, even with the thick branches, because of how dry it is. If you look on the inside of tomato branches, they're kind of very, very feathery. So it's very similar to having a light material like that grass I showed earlier. So if you just layer up a bunch of your tomato branches, or whatever branches you have, along the outside of your core, you'll eventually have a nice little foundation which you can use to pack mud onto. Now this is a good start, but I'm going to go one step further since I have access to a bunch of materials. And I'm going to go ahead and pack on a lot of lighter material like this grass or like some hay. We have a lot of weeds here on our farmland. So what we're going to go ahead and do is we're going to go ahead and gather some of those weeds now. Video, I had already gathered a bunch of the grasses and stuff. I obviously won't be using all of this, but I will likely be using it for fertilizers and other things. So gather a decent amount of your grasses and what have you. And then we'll go ahead and take that back over to our pit. So with your grasses, you want to break it into small bundles like this. You want to cover up any gaps that those leaves that you packed on earlier might not have covered. It's important that you get a nice uniform layer, primarily because this is where you're going to be packing the mud onto. And if you have gaps, it's going to be a lot more difficult later down the road to try and construct your little adobe oven. So we'll go ahead and take a look at both sides of this pit now. Here's the side that I managed to put all of the grasses and leaves onto. As you can see, there are very little gaps. Now if we take a look at the other side, you can see where you can still see wood and you can still see small holes inside of here. Those holes are going to make it very difficult, as I said later on. So again, you want to continue and pack up those gaps, and I'll come back to you once I'm done with that. Now once you've constructed your little hut, which I'll show you quickly all around, you'll notice it's fairly uniform all the way around, with the exception of this small gap around there. And that's about what you're looking at. Now you'll notice I haven't put anything directly on the top yet, and there's a reason for that. So what you're going to want to put on the top is a small amount of kindling. Now you can use small material like this, but I'd like to show you a method that I came up with for getting your own kindling. Now sometimes you'll find a piece of bark just like this, which on the inside will have this very stringy material. This material makes excellent kindling, but it can be a little annoying to start sometimes. So what I like to do is gather a decent amount of it, and then you're going to rub it back and forth in your hands. I'll show you a little bit what that looks like. So you take it and you just roll it. Now after a few minutes of rolling it, I'll show you what it looks like. So after a few minutes of rolling it, you should get this very thin and spindly material like this. Oh, hi Maggie. This is our stray cat that walks around the farm a lot, so it's a good cat. Anyway, you'll get this very thin spindly material, and this is usually very easy to light. So what you want to do is take like a dry leaf, put a few of those on top. Once you've got a few leaves on top, you can go ahead and toss your kindling right on top of that. Now this is going to be where you're going to start your fire. So now that we've got our base completed, we're going to go ahead and we're going to go gather some wood from the trench over there. So we'll walk over to the trench and then I'll come. Once you found a nice spot to gather your mud from, you'll want to go ahead and get a bucket of water. And you'll go ahead and pour that right where you're going to gather your mud. Then what you'll do is you'll just start to dig up your mud and put it in the bucket. Now depending on how big you built your base, you may need 2 or maybe even 3 buckets full of mud. But you don't need to repeat the water step for each time, you just need to continue shoveling. So I'll go ahead and gather the mud and then I'll head back over to the base and I'll show you how to finish it off. So after you've gathered your mud, you're going to go ahead and pack it around your base, just like this, and you're going to leave the top open. So I'll go ahead and go around the whole structure once so you can see what it looks like. And then the next step, of course, would be to go ahead and light off the top of the base. So we're doing a simple lighter and a bunch of kindling. And then just make sure that all the embers are towards the center of your base. So after you get your fire lit, you want to continuously feed the top with more and more fuel. And if you see it starts to smoke like this, you can sort of lift it up at one end and blow into the black masses there. You can see where there's a lot of already burnt material. A lot of that is actually ember. You'll see it'll get the flame going right away. And just continue to pack more on top. And occasionally with a decent sized stick, you want to pack it down further into the base. The goal is to generate as much heat as possible inside the structure without actually creating a flame inside the structure. That's the whole point of building the mud base around it, because it lets it get hot in there without there actually being any air present. So after this is done burning, I'll come back to it and show you what the yield is. After you've got the fire to where it's starting to smoke like this, and if you look inside, you can see sort of that the embers are all towards the bottom of the base. You go ahead and start to dig a couple small vents in the sides. I want about maybe 5 vents. And as you can see, even adding that one vent made it smoke a lot more. You don't want to vent it for too long. You only want to vent it for maybe 5 minutes at the most. And you'll start to see instantly that the smoke will go up much more. This will also make it a lot easier for you to blow in air in the long run. Once you've got a few vents going, you can blow through those vents directly. And you'll see it'll start to smoke up here, or you can just do it straight from the top again. As you can see, this piece of wood here is already starting to turn into a charcoal. And if you take the wood out, you can see it that it'll start to form ash layer on the top of it, which is the white substance. And that's what you don't want in your charcoal mix. So you want to try and limit the air, but it won't get hot enough if you don't vent it. So if we look through this little hole here, you can see a lot of the embers down towards the base. You want a sort of fire going, and that fire will be burning very thoroughly for the next few minutes until you close those vents. And that's just to build up heat. Something kind of cool that I noticed as it was going is because of the angle that the vents are at, it kind of formed like a small little fire tornado here. And it's almost about time to close down these vents, and that includes the top, so you'll need a little bit of mud to cover up the top of your little pyramid here. So I'm going to close up the vents here. I want to kind of pack those down kind of tight, because now you're really trying to limit the air. This is about where the charcoal step comes in. Alright, so now that all my vents are closed, I'm going to go gather a little bit more mud to suffocate the top up here. Closed your vents and you've locked down the top. Should have something that looks sort of like this. My sticks were long, so you might not see yours once you plug the top. And you should see a decent amount of smoke going. If you do, that's a good thing. The smoke is all the different oils and the other materials inside the wood evaporating off. And eventually you'll just be left with charcoal. Once the smoke starts to die down a bit, then you know your charcoal is about ready. And you can pull everything off. You'll rip down your mud walls, and you should have just a bunch of pile of charcoal which you can grind down and use for whatever you need. So if you'll look at some of the smoke that's coming off, you'll notice it's a little bit brown, and that's about the temperature you want to maintain. So if your smoke starts to go very light white, which is a lot of the water vapors coming off, and you don't see any of the brown in your smoke, then you're going to want to open it and add a little bit more hay like I did here. Eventually your smoke will start to get very blackish, and that's about the point where you want to cut it off, because the darker your smoke gets, the more material off of the wood it's actually burning. So in this case you're seeing a lot of the oils in the wood and a lot of the water vapor in the wood, but not much else. So a lot of what I have is pretty wet because of the mud that I used here. But eventually all this white smoke will start to turn to darker smoke, and at that point we can start to open it up and maybe douse it. So I took a small amount of the charcoal from inside of it. You can see here it's not quite done yet, but there is a lot of charcoal in there already. And you can tell this is going to be decent charcoal because if you squeeze it a couple of times, you can already get a very nice powder. And it's kind of stringy. This is good charcoal for filter papers, like if you're filtering water, and maybe even for some black powder. There's also good charcoal for making adobe because of its very long shape. You can see the fibers are kind of very long in this charcoal. Anyway, in a couple minutes we're going to go ahead and take this off. And we're going to break it open and we're going to take a look at what we have inside. I just wanted to demonstrate the properties of charcoal a little bit so you can kind of understand why we had to build this structure. So if you go ahead and look at this piece of charcoal here, it's a nice piece of charcoal. It's very black, but as soon as you expose it to air or a decent amount of oxygen, in this case I'm going to blow on it, you see it starts to glow red. And in the spots where it glows red, it turns white, which is just ash. And that's very bad for any kind of black powder or really carbon use, because it creates a lot of alkalinity in your solution. So what I like to do is I take a piece of wood that I had in the mix, and it's kind of just loose, so you can pull it out real fast and take a look at it without messing up the rest of your batch. And as you can see, it's pretty much burnt all the way through now. It's almost a solid charcoal. Might leave it in for a minute, maybe 2 minutes more, and then we'll go ahead and take this off of the fire. And we're going to go ahead and open it up, and I'll show you what's inside. I just wanted to demonstrate the properties of charcoal a little bit so you can kind of understand why we had to build this structure. So if you go ahead and look at this piece of charcoal here, it's a nice piece of charcoal. It's very black, but as soon as you expose it to air or a decent amount of oxygen, in this case I'm going to blow on it, you see it starts to glow red. And in the spots where it glows red, it turns white, which is just ash. And that's very bad for any kind of black powder or really carbon use, because it creates a lot of alkalinity in your solution. So what I like to do is I take a piece of wood that I had in the mix, and it's kind of just loose, so you can pull it out real fast and take a look at it without messing up the rest of your batch. And as you can see, it's pretty much burnt all the way through now. It's almost a solid charcoal. Might leave it in for a minute, maybe 2 minutes more, and then we'll go ahead and take this off of the fire. And we're going to go ahead and open it up, and I'll show you what's inside. Good. Alright, so once you're about ready to put it out, I'm going to go ahead and slowly douse it with water from the top. And then break down the walls a little carefully from this side. And you can see that it's completely charcoal all the way through. So then you can store the charcoal aside in a bucket or some other container, because you're going to have to douse it again later. And it's also going to have to be cleaned and filtered. So we'll go ahead and peel everything back just so you can get a good look at what's inside. Just press this and pause back. So the next step obviously is filtering your charcoal to make sure it's good quality. And as you can see, I've put a small cloth at the bottom of this pail, and the very bottom is a bunch of holes. So then you want to fill it with your charcoal mixtures, and the bigger the chunks the better, so it pays to be kind of gentle when removing it from the actual pit itself. And then once you've got a decent amount in here, you go ahead and begin to wash it with some water. You can see from the bottom that you get a lot of muddy water, so this gets rid of a lot of the mud. And in the top, if you swirl it a bit, you can start to get some of those stems and the other unburnt stuff to the top, which makes it easy to pick them out. You want to repeat this process for the rest of your charcoal, and then you'll have a decent amount of pure charcoal that you can use for anything. So this is our final yield after this project. And as you can see, there's still a few stems and twigs inside of here, which is obviously detrimental to your charcoal yield. A few things you can do, which is what we're going to do, is place it in a metal bucket and heat it. The whole point of this project wasn't to generate high quality product. Instead, this was to demonstrate that were you in the wilderness, this would be an absolute guaranteed method of generating charcoal. This whole rocket has a few caveats that we're intending to implement intentionally. A few of them include different fuel requirements that we're not allowed to surpass, and others are every material that we use has to be able to be generated from the wilderness, with the exception of the rocket body, of course, just for safety reasons. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go ahead and show that we can make the charcoal, we're going to show that we can get the nitrates, we're going to show that we can get the sulfur, and other materials that we need for the rocket fuel from nature. Apart from that, we're also going to place limitations on the types of materials or chemicals that we're able to add into the fuel. Now that that's been explained, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what Cell is. Our company is focused on making innovations in science and every field of science, whether it be chemistry, biology, anything. So this rocket is more of a method for us to show you that we're capable of doing the things that we say. And in the future, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and build carbon scrubbers and maybe innovations in vehicles and transport. You name it, we're going to try and do it. So our goal today is to demonstrate to you that our abilities, that we say that we can do these things, we can. And if you'd like to support us, we're going to go ahead and include our link to our Patreon and our Discord, and you can go ahead and join and talk to any of us, the original founders, or anyone in the community for that matter. And if you support us on Patreon, every dollar goes to continuing Cell projects. None of that money actually goes to me or any of the other workers in the Cell project currently. Later on down the road, as we start to generate excess revenue, some of that money will go to us, just so that way we can continue to hire new people, new minds, and to continue to innovate in the field of science. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the video today, and I will hope that you'll come back and see our other videos in the future.
We would like to take a moment to thank our patrons and donators, Anubis, Dapper Noodle, Micro, Kaitso, Vasilius, and Mr. Marshmallow. Thank you for supporting us.